The Syrian opposition ends a conference in Cairo, and Paris will host the Friends of Syria conference on Friday. Over 61 people killed in Syria today, mostly in the city of Daraa. And the regime intensifies its military campaigns on the Syrian cities, and the people protest against the regime. Good evening and welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. The two-day meeting of the Syrian opposition groups closed in Cairo today, reaching a consensus on building a unified country and protecting the innocent civilians. Also, the document was issued specifying the common political vision of the Syrian opposition about the challenges of transition and setting the foundations of the constitutional future of Syria, which are justice, democracy, and pluralism. The participants agreed that a political solution in Syria begins when the regime is toppled, and they also confirmed their support for the Syrian Freedom Army and called on all Syrian people to work on the protection of the civil peace and the national unity. The Syrian National Compact document, which was finalized after the Cairo conference, concluded that the unity of the Syrian people is important. More about the other items of the pact we see next.
The Syrian people are one. On the basis of a comprehensive national reconciliation, the principle of God, religion, and the homeland for all. A commitment to international charters and Convention of Human Rights, social and economic rights, and to ensure the enjoyment of these rights for citizens and residents alike. The Syrian people are free in their home and country, and the political unity is indivisible and may not give up any inch of it, including the occupied Golan. The Syrian people have the right to fight for the restoration of its occupied territories by all means possible. The formation of individual, public freedoms and collective bases for one relationship between the sons of one homeland. The state shall guarantee public freedoms, including freedom of access to information and media, and the formation of NGOs, trade unions and political parties, freedom of belief and practice, and the freedom of demonstration and to strike peacefully. People are the source of legitimacy and sovereignty that are achieved through a democratic republican system. The state recognizes the existence of the Syrian Kurds within its people, with national identity and legitimacy, according to international covenants and instruments within the framework of the Syrian unity. Compliance with international conventions, complete separation between the executive, legislative, and judicial authorities. The new constitution will establish a pluralistic democratic system and the modern election system which guarantees the right of participation of all intellectual and political parties. The Syrian army is a national institution that protects the country and safeguards its independence and sovereignty over its territory, ensures safety to national security, and does not interfere in political life. And finally, the adoption of the principle of administrative decentralization.
Syrian opposition leader Kamal Labwani read the closing statement at the conference and demanded a mechanism that provides mandatory protection of civilians and a timetable for the immediate implementation of the Arab League and the UN Security Council decisions. He also said that the attendees agreed that the change in Syria will only take place by the will of the Syrian revolutionaries who are revolting against this oppressive regime. On the sidelines of the conference, Nabil al-Arabi, the Arab League Secretary General, met with the ambassadors of the 5 Permanent Security Council members, as well as the ambassadors of the European Union, in the presence of the Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmed Dawood Uglo and the Deputy of the United Nations Arab League Joint Envoy Nasser al-Qudwa, in addition to a meeting in the presence of Qatar, Iraq, and Kuwait's representatives in the conference. The statement stated that the Arab League Secretary General addressed during this meeting the results of the Geneva meeting, and that the focus in particular was on the steps agreed upon during the meeting, particularly the question of forming a transitional government in preparation for the process of peaceful transition of power in Syria. And to tell us more about the Cairo conference, we have with us on the line from Montreal, Afra Jalabi, member of the Syrian National Council. Afra, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Could you please give us an idea about the outcome of the Cairo meeting? What's your take on it?
It's a positive step. The Syrian opposition has been struggling to come together after being marginalized and fragmented for over 50 years. So it is expected to run into challenges of communication and coordination. But given and considering everything that the Syrian people have endured for the last 50 years under martial law, I think there have been great achievements that we need to emphasize. I know sometimes the media tends to take certain events and focus on certain frictions or tensions, but in general, I think there has been a great deal of development.
High expectations with the Friend of Syria conference in Paris on Friday?
Well, it's just going to be another phase of trying to perhaps get more international consent and create a far more or a stronger moral stance towards the Syrian revolution. Rima Fleihan, in one of her opening remarks at the conference, actually stated that there is not enough of a moral stance towards the Syrian revolution throughout the world. And she said this in front of Nabil Arabi and other ambassadors and ministers. So the Syrian people feel that the international agenda is not really moving fast enough to accommodate the demands and also the incredible bloodshed that is taking place in Syria. Yes, we are always aware that the political process is slower than disaster kind of situations. But on the other hand, when you have an escalation of violence and the bloodshed is increasing on a daily basis. I mean, the last few days, over 100 people keep dying, either 130 or 150. The numbers are quite staggering. And only in June alone, over 2,300 people died, and including over 250 children. And so these numbers, I think, need to really alarm the conscience of the international community to step up to their responsibility and to have a stronger moral responsibility or response to the Syrian people.
Of course, Afra, thank you so much for your input. That was Afra Jalabi, member of the Syrian National Council from Montreal. Moving over to the latest developments on ground in Syria, where the Syrian Human Rights Network documented the death of 26 unarmed civilians, including 6 children, 5 of them in Daraa suburbs, as the regime forces stormed its suburbs this morning. Moreover, many towns and villages within Daraa province were heavily attacked by the regime, who used mortar shells and artillery fire, killing many people, including children, and also setting many residential buildings on fire. In addition to that, huge blasts shook other parts of the province, while helicopters were seen hovering at very low altitudes. And several victims fell dead and others were wounded due to the shelling on a Shajra town in Daraa. The bombardment also reached the town and the cities of Al-Lajat, Atman, Nasib, Basra al-Sham, and Naima, Kafr al-Shams, which the regime forces had stormed and burned several houses in. Meanwhile, the regime forces also launched a campaign of raids and arbitrary arrests in the towns of Al-Khal and Sahm al-Jolan, and most of them in Horan village. A new massacre was committed in Msifra in Daraa suburbs today, where the regime forces targeted the residential buildings in the town of Msifra using mortar shells, which led to the death of 2 children, while their parents are in intensive care. And we apologize in advance for not showing you the pictures due to their gruesome nature. To know more about the situation in Daraa, we talked to Ahmed Al-Masri, who is a member of the Horan Coordinating Committee. Good evening, Ahmed.
Good evening.
Can you please brief us about the latest developments in Daraa?
Okay, in Daraa today, I think fire on the shell closest for the civil base and already to the child window to the east and west. They are bombing now from a few days ago all areas in Dara, all the village, in Nasib, in Al-Shajara, in Al-Msefer. There's some house bombing from the Syrian regime army in the Al-Msefer regime, in the Al-Msefer village, and they took two little child killed in this house. Name is Hussein and Hassan Ahmeda. And they bombing like 10 or 12 house in the Al-Shajara village, East in Dara. And there's so few guys killed in this village. And in Dara city, the sniper is walking and the top of the building. They shot everybody, can move in the street. They killed a few of my friends from Dara. I will say a name of them. Tamer, Bid al-Masada. The sniper threw him in the Dara city today. And they bombing all the area in the Dara city, Dara al-Balad, Tariq al-Stad, Al-Mukhayyam, for Palestinian camp, and they killed everybody can move in the street.
Yes, yes. Well, Ahmed, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for being with us. That was Ahmed Al-Masri, a member of Horan Coordinating Committee. Coming up later in the bulletin, Turkey finds the missing bodies of its two pilots. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. Demonstrations swept the day in various cities and rural areas in Syria, mainly concentrated in Daraa, Deir ez-Zor, Idleb, Hamah, and Aleppo, where unarmed protesters confidently declared that they will continue to struggle to overthrow al-Assad's oppressive regime, pleading for support and the urgent need to sustaining the Syrian Freedom Army. The regime forces heavily bombed the city of Idlib, where several civilians were killed and others were injured. More about Idlib we see in the following report.
Like all the other rebellious Syrian cities, the mortar shells fired by the regime have been pouring onto the city of Khan Sheikhoun in Idlib for 3 consecutive days, which led to the death of many civilians and the destruction of many houses. Many areas in Ma'arat al-Nu'man were also targeted by the random firing of the government forces. Meanwhile, the town of Al-Habib and the city of Kafr were specifically and heavily targeted by the helicopters of the regime. This comes in conjunction with the flying of many military airplanes above the town of Jobas and many other areas, scouting for any activists. A military campaign, as reported by activists, stated that the regime forces were using citizens as human shields, especially in their invasion to the city of Ariha. And elsewhere in Salqin, the town witnessed heavy clashes between the Syrian Freedom Army and the security and guerrilla forces of the Syrian regime. In another manner, the humanitarian and food situation in Idlib is catastrophic, since the regime is besieging the city and not giving the citizens a chance to supply their families with the appropriate amount of basic supplies.
The Syrian Freedom Army in the city of Salqin were able to capture a number of regime militia men, and broadcasted pictures from there show the situation of the parents and children due to the heavy shelling by the regime forces on the city, while one of the mothers confronted her son's killer, demanding his trial. The Revlution organization in Damascus suburbs stated that the regime forces ran over 4 civilians with one of their tanks in Masraba, which came after air attacks that targeted the city, while the security forces burnt many houses. Meanwhile, in Douma, activists broadcasted images showing the regime forces targeting a civilian and burning his car, while the videos showed the guerrilla forces targeting a mosque. Elsewhere, the town of Rayhan was bombarded by the government forces, which led to injuring many civilians. Staying in the city of Masraba in Damascus suburbs, which is being bombed violently and randomly by the regime's army amid the storming of armored vehicles and tanks. Also, an explosion rocked the town of Mqilbiya. Meanwhile, demonstrations continued despite the blockade and bombardment in many areas. These demonstrations demanded freedom and the overthrow of the regime. The regime forces are carrying a heavy military campaign on Deir ez-Zor province, which continues for the 3rd consecutive day. While the humanitarian situation is becoming worse, more about Deir ez-Zor updates are in the following report.
As in every morning, columns of tanks and armored vehicles began shelling the cities in Deir ez-Zor from Al-Tala'a camp, Asuyuf roundabout, Nadi Dubat area and Al-Jabal, with rocket launchers and mortars, where several cities and villages witnessed heavy destruction. The neighborhoods of Al-Jbayla, Al-Matar Al-Qadim, Al-Ummal, Al-Sheikh Yassin, Al-Ardi were under heavy shelling that caused massive destruction and a complete paralysis in all forms of life. Meanwhile, the regime forces used helicopters to attack civilian neighborhoods such as Al-Hamidiyya, Al-Sheikh Yassin, and Al-Jbayla. Deir ez-Zor suburbs was also targeted by the regime's helicopters, which witnessed violent shelling on the villages of Al-Mray'a, as well as the towns of Al-Bu'amar, Tabiya, and Al-Shhil, which are still being exposed to heavy shelling that resulted in massive destruction. Al-Muhassam village is also subjected to heavy shelling from Deir ez-Zor airport, with planes still flying in the sky since the early morning. The continuous military campaign and the blockade could not end the people's will to overthrow the regime.
The neighborhoods of Al-Qusayr and Al-Sabuni witnessed heavy firing from members of the regime's security and guerrilla forces. The regime security forces were also deployed in the neighborhoods of Al-Aliyat and Al-Andalus, and they launched a campaign of raids and arrests in most parts of the city, while pictures broadcasted showed the presence of UN observers at the Sabahi roundabout. Coming up in the bulletin, Turkey finds the missing bodies of its 2 pilots. Moving on to Aleppo province, where the regime bombed Hayyan, Bianoun, Hreitan using artillery fire and rockets from military barracks in a Zahra neighborhood. Meanwhile, several victims fell dead and others were wounded after the heavy shelling that targeted Anadan, while helicopters bombed Al-Atarib and Azaz. This situation did not prevent demonstrations from going out, calling for freedom and demanding the overthrow of the regime. Shelling was also renewed from artillery and helicopters on Selma Resort and its villages in Latakia suburbs. Meanwhile, flames of the fire and blinding clouds of smoke have been rising in the sky of the Kurds mountain in Latakia for 2 days now. and the clouds of smoke are reaching Sahl al-Ghab in Hamah suburbs. The city of Homs and its surroundings are still under constant shelling with mortars and rocket launchers. Meanwhile, the regime forces shelled heavily the old neighborhoods of Homs, Al-Qusur, Al-Khalidiyya, Jurat al-Shiyah, Talbisa, Al-Qusayr, Abil, Al-Buwaida, Al-Hawla, Al-Rastan, Al-Husn Castle, Al-Jusiyya, and Nizari, while the vertical aviation bombed several regions.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar.
Activists reported that the regime forces carried out demolition campaigns for the buildings in Jurat al-Shiyah by shelling the city with tanks. Activists also showed videos of the destruction that was left in the neighborhood. They also reported that massive military reinforcements reached the neighborhood of Ad-Dablan, which came in conjunction with the massive displacement of citizens in Homs.
Homs 4/7/2012.
The Turkish armed forces reported that on Wednesday they found the bodies of the 2 pilots shot down by Syria last month and their assistant in the bottom of the sea. Now they are trying to pull them out. The army has been looking for the bodies since the airplane was shot down on the 22nd of June, and this week hired a specialized vessel to lift debris from a depth of about 1,000 meters underwater. In the political updates, France hosts on Friday a meeting of the Friends of Syria, but in the absence of Russia, who informed Paris that it does not wish to participate. Meanwhile, the United States proposed a draft resolution to the Human Rights Council, stressing the need for an international investigation of the human rights situation in Syria. More in the following report.
Despite Robert Smoot's return to Syria, ambiguity is still surrounding the UN observers' mission. While the observers are still undergoing inspection visits to several Syrian cities despite the suspension of their mission. While the mission is still expecting an international decision in the near future to settle their fate. This comes at a time when the United States introduced a new draft resolution to the Human Rights Council. This draft resolution expresses its worries about the disturbing consequences that can result from the failure to implement Annan's plan and stresses the need for an international investigation into the situation of human rights in Syria. The UN members will vote on the draft resolution on Friday, condemning the flagrant violations of human rights and calling for the application of Annan's 6-point plan without any preconditions. Annan's plan and the developments of the Syrian crisis will be also discussed in Paris, which will host a meeting of the Friends of Syria, but in the absence of Russia, according to the French Foreign Minister, while an official in the State Department announced that Clinton will be participating in the meeting. On the other hand, the spokeswoman for the U.S. State Department, Victoria Nuland, confirmed the importance of the meeting in terms of giving a momentum to the efforts of developing a strategy to the stage that is coming after the transfer of power in Syria, in addition to the results of the Geneva meeting and the Cairo conference. These remarks came after the statement of the spokesman of Kofi Annan, Ahmed Fawzi, who considered that Geneva meeting has witnessed a change in the positions of Russia and China, which used repeatedly the veto against the international efforts to isolate al-Assad and to end the conflict and begin a democratic transition in Syria. Meanwhile, Ahmed Fawzi stressed on the need for a ceasefire so that Syria can witness a real political transition.
In a move to help the Syrian refugees in Jordan, Italy has provided Jordan with a field hospital to support its efforts in helping the Syrian refugees. The hospital is equipped with specialized diagnostic labs, and medical services in Jordan will transfer the hospital to the designated site, so it will be ready for work within 2 weeks. It is also worth mentioning that an Italian plane loaded with medical aid, medicines, and emergency supplies arrived in Amman 2 weeks ago for the same purpose. And before we end our bulletin, we remind you of the main stories. The Syrian opposition ends its conference in Cairo, and Paris will host the Friends of Syria conference on Friday. Over 61 people killed in Syria today, mostly in the city of Daraa. And the regime intensifies its military campaigns on Syrian cities, and people protest against the regime. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. You can join us again tomorrow at the same time for the latest updates on the Syrian revolution. And you can watch us on our Facebook page. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.